I would like to show you what I would call my sportsmanship game control toolbox. Now, none of this is my opinion. I'm just going to be giving you exact quotes of rules that are in the rule book. And actually, the vast majority of them have been in the rule book for as long as I can remember. Some of them were added maybe 10 years ago, but they've all been there. And I would propose to you that most of you know some of them, but almost none of you know all of them. So I think everyone can learn from this. So let's take a look. The first tool is Rule 115. And it refers to something that occurs prior to the beginning of the game. That's when everybody's all smiley and happy-pappy, isn't it? Well, and I quote, "Prior to the game, the referee shall meet with the head coaches and captains and explain that everyone is expected to exhibit good sportsmanship throughout the game." Now, let's review this again. First of all, note that it doesn't say that it's a good idea to do this or we'd like you to do this.
So let it be written. So let it be done.
It says you shall do it. It is a rule. I'd like to equate it to the rule that if there's a penalty on the last play of a quarter, you shall run an untimed down. Now, if you don't follow that rule, you're not following the rules, period. So this is a rule. It shall be followed. And it applies to every level of play. Little League, freshman football, JV football, especially JV football. Okay? We expect you to do this at all levels of play in every game. And I'll tell you, if I was a coach and I saw an official, begin the game and not ask me this question, I'd have a pretty good idea that he's probably taking an attitude of it. He's mailing it in, if you would. Okay? So we expect you to do this at every game. Please note, and this was a quote, I got it right out of the rule book, that everyone is expected to exhibit good sportsmanship. Everyone. That includes assistant coaches. That includes fans. That includes anybody on that sideline or even the stands. Okay? And this is supposed to occur throughout the game, not just in the first quarter. Okay? When it gets intense, at the end of the fourth quarter, we're still supposed to be exhibiting good sportsmanship. Now, this is a very nice tool. I'll tell you, if you go to the trouble, and it's not trouble, it's the rule, if you would go to the trouble of making sure that you make the head coach agree to this at the beginning of the game. Okay, they are expected to exhibit good sportsmanship. If I may, I'll give you a quick story. I was at a JV game last year, and of course we did what you're supposed to do, and we had the classic punt play where the kickers first touched the ball, and then the receivers picked it up, ran with it, and fumbled, and the kickers got the ball back. We then, of course, correctly, because there was no penalty on the play, gave the ball back at the point of first touching to the receivers. Now, the fans of that team went crazy when we did that because I guess they didn't know the rule. The coach didn't complain. And we started the series, and I'll tell you what, I'm used to taking some guff every so often, and we can take a little bit, but there was one specific fan that was just raising holy heck, and it was third down, and they were still raising heck, and it was starting to really kind of influence the environment of the game, if you would. So, and by the way, this was the team that was ahead. So I stopped the game, and I went over to the coach, and I said my standard, "Coach, you said before the game that you were going to encourage good sportsmanship throughout this game." And he shook his head yes. And I said, well, Coach, and the guy was screaming back in the stands. I didn't have to say another word. The coach turned around, went back to the person in the stands, and I didn't hear another word from that person. And I suspect that that person did not say anything in the rest of the games of the season as well. So this is, and now if I had not called that coach before the game, or if I had not talked to that coach before the game and made sure that he promised to encourage sportsmanship throughout the game, I wouldn't have that tool in my pocket. So it's critical that you do this to both coaches in all games at every level of play. And it's the rule. Another tool you have available to you is the points of emphasis. And I can tell you right now, looking at the books for the last many years, every other year, at least every other year, sportsmanship has been a point of emphasis and safety has been a point of emphasis. So, use this to your advantage. Whenever you're talking with a coach, you can always say, well, Coach, you can at least say, since it's at least every other year, Coach, last year that was a point of emphasis. Or this year, Coach, that's a point of emphasis this year. If it was last year, you can say, well, we should have learned from that from last year. Okay, you can always note the points of emphasis, especially when there's sportsmanship. And I know that you want to encourage sportsmanship, right? Okay, so please know your points of emphasis, especially sportsmanship. The next tool I'd like to remind you about is Rule 981. And now, before I tell you what it is, I got to tell you, every official should know, of course, all the rules. I am pretty sure that they do not need to know exactly what page all of the rules are on. But this rule, I suggest to you, is one of the very few that it's going to be a major advantage for you to know exactly what page it is on. Maybe even the reference if you want to be fancy. 981 is on page 75. And that is the rule for unsportsmanlike conduct. And they actually list 10 specific things that are unsportsmanlike conduct. I want to talk about the first 4. It begins, no coach or trainer or other team attendant shall act in an unsportsmanlike manner. Now, well, who's to say what they are? Well, it lists them specifically. Some examples specifically include, and I would propose to you, of the first 4, A, B, C, and D, almost every official knows A and C. No coach should use profanity, vulgar language, or gestures. Everyone knows that. And no one should disrespectfully address an official. Everyone knows that. But in my observation, I've seen many people that don't know B and D, or at least they don't use it to their advantage. Consider what B is. B is if someone attempts to influence a decision by an official. That's unsportsmanlike conduct, and it's specifically noted on page 75 of the rule book, 981. Attempting to influence a decision by an official. D,
Believe it or not.
is indicating objections to an official's decision. And it's specifically noted on page 75 of the rule book. And by the way, all of these have been in the rule book for at least, all I can speak of, 30 years. Nothing's new. Everyone should know them, and I would argue that everyone should know what page they're on. I should tell you that if you check your rule books over the last few years, I'm a rule book collector myself, that this rule actually got moved to page 71 last year. Really messed me up, I'll tell you right now. Over 30 years, it's been on page 75 forever. Last year, it got moved to page 71. Anyway, it's back, thankfully, to page 75. Now, Let's consider a couple things about all four of these. First of all, it applies to assistant coaches. Yes, sir, assistant coaches cannot attempt to influence a decision by an official, or assistant coaches cannot indicate objections to an official's decision, nor can trainers, attendants, or anybody else. And it applies at all levels. JV, freshman, Little League. Note that, please. Okay? And if it is unsportsmanlike conduct, so if someone does it twice, they're out of the game. Now, don't you dare throw 2 flags on somebody for these. In fact, I'm going to tell you not to throw any flags for the most part. This is a tool, not a penalty. The use of this tool is basically preventive officiating. Okay? For instance, if you're I remember I had another story, if I may. I was in a JV game last year, and I'm telling you, this team was way up, and one of the assistant coaches was screaming holding, or of course on the other team, every play. Now, I'll take that every so often, but remember, the kids are watching this adult, okay? And he's doing it in front of, everybody, the fans, the kids, everybody. Well, every play, when it got to about the 6th time in a row, I called a timeout, and I said, Coach, of course I used my first rule, you told me at the beginning of this game that you were going to encourage sportsmanship. I'm talking to the head coach now. I only talk to the head coach. You told me you were going to encourage sportsmanship. Now, when your assistant coach screams holding 6 plays in a row, he's not attempting to influence a decision by us, is he? Because if he was, on page 75, it specifically states that that's unsportsmanlike conduct, and that's a 15-yard foul. He's not trying to do that, is he? I hope he won't do that anymore. Because if he did it twice, he'd be out of the game. Okay, and I'm hoping, as you told me at the beginning of the game, that you will encourage sportsmanship, and that will end soon. Okay? Or in another situation, after a call has been made, and the coach over and over and over again is complaining about it, I say, Coach, you told me at the beginning of the game that you were going to encourage sportsmanship. Okay? You're not indicating an objection to my decision, are you? Because if you were, on page 75, it says that that's unsportsmanlike conduct. Specifically says it. Okay, now I got to tell you, in that JV game, I'll never forget it, because it was in the 2nd quarter, and that coach went into the locker room, I'm sure. In fact, he said to me, you got to be kidding me. Are you telling me that I'm not allowed to yell holding, or I'm not allowed to yell at you guys? I said, Coach, it's on page 75. And son of a gun, this is why I remember it. He came back after halftime and said, you know what? I apologize. You are absolutely right. That will end now. And that's why I say it's very nice to know exactly what page. Give them a head start when they look it up at halftime. Anyway, it's a very nice tool to use. A and C don't need much notification. Everybody knows them. In fact, if someone uses profanity, you may be the type of person that warns, or you may be, depending on the severity of it, you may have to call a foul. Okay? But B and D rarely ever need to be enforced. Make no mistake, I'm not encouraging you to call those fouls. I'm encouraging you to use this tool to encourage sportsmanship, okay, as a preventative officiating tool. Got it? The last tool that I would like to present to you is Rule 3-5-11. You don't need to know what page this one is on. Okay, everybody knows this exists. But before we do that, I'd like you to consider the relationship between that rule and the following situation. Suppose, if you would, that you left your sweet mother to babysit your young kids. And she was nice enough to do it. You went out maybe to the movies with your wife, and you came back, and somehow by mistake, your sweet mother had made a mistake and maybe let the kids watch a TV show that they really weren't allowed to watch. Or maybe let them stay up later than they were supposed to, or something like that. Okay, now mind you, they're still there, they're watching, your kids are watching you. What would you say to your mother in front of your kids? Would you say something like, "You dumb biddy, how could you do that? You're so stupid"? Or could you say, "Wait a minute, this is a learning moment here. My kids can learn from the way I treat my mother, someone in my family. They can learn that we always respect others." Consider that. This is a learning moment. Or should I go into another room and explain to my mother the situation and maybe have some secret yelling there? Or should I, in front of my children, respect my mother and discuss the reason why the possible mistake was made and, have it out kind of a thing, respectfully with her? Well, I think you know the answer. And consider that when we talk about Rule 3511, which is, once again, a quote. A player directed by his coach or the head coach, not directed by the assistant coach, directed by his coach or the head coach, may request and be granted a timeout for purposes of reviewing a possible misapplication or misinterpretation of a rule, provided that the request is made prior to the time the ball becomes alive, following the play to be reviewed. When granted, the referee will confer with the coach at the sideline in front of his children, in front of his team box in the field of play. Now, let me emphasize a couple things about this rule. First of all, it can be called by any player, that's someone on the field now, not a substitute, or the head coach. It cannot be called by a trainer or an assistant coach. Now, we always want to respect these people. We want to respect everybody. So if they attempt to call it, that's why you need to know who the head coach is, by the way. Okay? If they attempt to call it, then respectfully say, "Sir, the rule doesn't allow you to call it. You can ask your head coach to call it, and please do so if you wish." Okay? But watch who you accept doing this, because we know that if we call it and the coach is wrong, which usually they are, they're going to be charged a timeout. Okay? So we don't want to inadvertently be charging timeouts to anybody other than a player, someone on the field, or a head coach.
With all due respect, sir, I believe this is going to be our finest hour.
Now, when we do call a conference timeout, please make note that we are going to confer at the sideline in front of the team box. There's not going to be a secret screaming session in the middle of the field. Okay? This is a learning moment. This is a way to demonstrate sportsmanship, to show the players that adults aren't driven by the situation, by the way they act, but rather they always respect each other. And we can discuss the situation respectfully in front of them as an example. Okay, so note where that's what's going to happen, and note who's watching you. Please consider that. Okay? Lastly, I want you to consider the power of the use of this rule in preventive officiating. If a coach is becoming belligerent, it's very simple to just say, "Coach, do you want a conference timeout? Are you disagreeing with it? Something. If you want a conference timeout." Now note that you're risking losing a timeout if you're wrong here. But do you want a conference? Because if you don't want a conference timeout, coach, this subject is over. It needs to be over, doesn't it? Because recall that you told me at the beginning of the game that you were going to encourage sportsmanship. And we know on page 75 of the rule book, unsportsmanlike conduct specifically is noted as indicating objections to an official's decision. Now, if you want to discuss this, we can call a conference timeout. But if you don't want to discuss it, you don't leave me much option as to what to do here. So I would ask you to drop it at this point or call a conference timeout. Okay? Note that that is a very nice tool that's in your pocket and that you can use it. Now be careful to not overuse any of these tools. Always respect everyone on that field, other officials, players, and coaches at all times. And lastly, I would like to add that if you do make a mistake, and I can tell you, you couldn't have made as many as I have made, but if you do make a mistake, admit it, and admit it right away. You'll gain way more respect by doing that. Think of Ed Hockley, who had an inadvertent whistle on the NFL field, admitted it right away. Now, he took some heat, didn't he? But how much heat would he have taken if we sat there and argued about it on the field? Okay? I want to say that he admitted that within 2 seconds of doing it. And of course, he really felt bad. So use him as an example. If you make a mistake, admit it right away. That kind of stuff happens. And as my predecessor of over 30 years used to say at the end of all his presentations, my time is up, and I thank you for yours.